This is Michael ASMR. A few years ago I saw a video about flicking and plucking. Plucking and flicking. Not an adult video or anything. An ASMR video. I don't know what the channel was called. I think the channel isn't there now. But I think that Kelly Belly did a video like this that was based on that channel and that video. So I think they've deleted it now. But I liked it. I like the trigger. I've never actually done it. It's a bit like plucking basically. But I thought a little bit of an homage to that. Plucking and flicking and flicking and plucking and all the rest of it. With my own version of it, I guess. Right? I mean, I haven't seen the video for years. I don't know if it's even there now. I think the channel was deleted. Anyway, I'll just say the same thing. I've said the same thing 5 times already. How about I just do the trigger? That's a good idea. Pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick. You pluck with one hand, pluck, and you flick with the other. Flick, pluck, flick. Life is all about give and take. Pluck, flick, or take and give in this instance. Pluck, flick, pluck, 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 flick, pluck, 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 flick, 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 pluck, flick. I did a double pluck there. Apologies. Pluck, flick. Sometimes you take. Pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick. And then you reverse it. Pluck, flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, pluck, pluck, flick. A few long plucks, pluck, 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 and a few short flicks. Flick, 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 flick. Pluck, 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 pluck. Flick, 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 flick. Flick, 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 flick. Flick, 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 flick. almost feels rude to flick. Plick. Plick. Flick. 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 All in the spirit of ASMR. Flick. 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 Watch, look. I can do it to myself. Flick. Self-inflicted wound. Flick. Flick. Flick for you, flick for me. Flick, 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 flick. Does your video feature self-harm? No. Flick, 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 flick. Pluck, pluck. I probably shouldn't pluck myself. Pluck, 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 flick, 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 flick. Flick, 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 pluck, 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 pluck. My eyes are red. God almighty. Long weekend. Pluck, 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 flick, flick, flick. That's not flick. What are you doing that for? Oh, that's your fault, isn't it? Yeah, come on. You have one job after all. Am I talking to you or myself? That's the question with every single ASMR video, isn't it? Pluck, 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 flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick, pluck, flick, pluck, flick, 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 net, flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick, 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 flick. Look at these expressive eyes. Flick, flick, pluck, 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 flick, flick, flick. Are you creeped out at all? Flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick, 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 pluck, 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 flick, pluck, 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 flick, 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 pluck, pluck, body plucks. Pluck. 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 You might as well get a bit of a workout while you're doing this. Pluck. Pluck.